The morning the orders came down, the sky over southern Europe was clear in a way that made men uneasy. It was October of 1944, and the war had begun to feel different. Not quieter, never quieter, but heavier, as if the land itself had grown tired of carrying secrets. Along the jagged borderlands near the eastern Dolomites, German units were being shuffled constantly. Reconnaissance flights were failing. Supply convoys were vanishing. Entire patrols reported radio contact one moment and silence the next. Among those reassigned was a 34-year-old Luftwaffe pilot whose name would later be erased from official memory. He had flown since he was barely old enough to shave. By that point in the war, he'd logged dozens of sorties over mountain corridors and frozen passes, mapping terrain no one expected to hold for long. But this assignment was different. His aircraft had been grounded days earlier due to mechanical issues, and rather than wait for repairs, command transferred him temporarily to a joint unit operating armored vehicles through a high-altitude route used to evacuate sensitive equipment. It wasn't unusual. By late 1944, pilots were being used wherever manpower was thin. What was unusual was the destination. The route cut through a snowbound region locals avoided even in peacetime, a narrow valley near the edge of a glacial shelf, where weather shifted without warning and compasses behaved strangely. The terrain was littered with abandoned equipment from earlier campaigns. Tanks frozen in place. Half-buried trucks. Things the war had dropped and never come back for. He boarded the armored vehicle just before dawn. The tank, an aging but heavily modified model, was tasked with escorting a small convoy through the pass. Radios were unreliable there, so the plan was simple. Cross before nightfall, check in from the far side, and keep moving west. None of that happened. When the convoy failed to report by evening, command assumed delay. When the next day passed, they blamed weather. By the third day, search units were dispatched, but the mountains gave nothing back. No smoke. No tracks. No wreckage. Only silence. Officially, the young pilot was listed as missing during operational transfer. No aircraft loss. No battlefield report. Just a name on a growing ledger of men the war had swallowed without explanation. What few records survived noted one chilling detail: he was not alone. At least 3 other armored units had been sent through neighboring routes that same week. 2 returned damaged. 1 never responded again. And yet, there was no evidence of enemy engagement. No crater. No shell fragments. No witnesses. The region itself seemed to resist investigation. Avalanches erased tracks within hours. Snowstorms buried roads overnight. Patrols sent to retrace the convoy's path reported equipment failures, sudden disorientation, and in one case, a radio transmission that cut off mid-sentence with no sign of combat. After 2 weeks, the search was quietly suspended. By winter, the area was sealed off entirely. Years passed. Then decades. The war ended, borders shifted, and the mountains remained. Veterans who had served nearby spoke of that pass in hushed tones, calling it a dead corridor. Locals told stories of engines heard beneath the ice during sudden thaws, or metal shapes visible for moments before being swallowed again by snow. No official investigation reopened the case. Until 60 years later, when something impossible surfaced. It didn't begin with a search team. It began with a thermal anomaly. In the early 2000s, climate researchers monitoring glacial movement in the region noticed irregular readings beneath a long stable ice field. The data suggested a large metallic mass embedded deep below the surface, too dense to be rock, too structured to be debris from recent decades. At first, it was dismissed as sensor error. But the readings persisted. When historical maps were overlaid with wartime logistics routes, One line stood out, a forgotten armored path that vanished into the ice and never emerged. What followed was a quiet collaboration between civilian researchers and military historians. No press releases. No announcements. Just permits filed under geological survey work. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed it. Something massive lay frozen beneath the snow. The first excavation attempt was cautious, slow, and unsettling. As ice was removed layer by layer, the shape became clearer, not an aircraft, as some expected, but angular. Armored. A tank. Perfectly preserved by cold. What made the discovery truly disturbing wasn't just what they found, but how it was positioned. The vehicle wasn't damaged the way battle losses usually were. There were no burn marks. No collapsed armor. It sat upright, angled slightly downhill, as if it had been deliberately driven into the ice and then abandoned. Or sealed. When the hatch was finally forced open, the team expected emptiness. They were wrong. Inside, still seated at his post, was a skeleton. No insignia remained on the uniform. No identification tags. Just frozen fabric, brittle leather, and bones locked in place by ice that had taken 6 decades to release its grip. The posture told its own story. This wasn't a man who had died instantly. His hands were positioned near the interior latch, as if he had tried to get out, as if something had prevented him. The discovery raised a question no one could answer. Why would a trained pilot, reassigned or not, end up entombed inside a tank, miles from any recorded battlefield, in a place where no fighting was ever confirmed? And more troubling still, why did military archives show that multiple units sent into that region were erased from records in the same month? As investigators began digging into declassified files, one overlooked transmission surfaced, filed, misdated, and never followed up. A final radio log. It didn't describe enemy fire. It didn't request reinforcements. It simply said, "They are not on the map." And then, nothing. What exactly the convoy encountered in those mountains would remain unclear. But as the ice continued to melt, it became evident that the tank was not the only thing buried there, and that the disappearance of the young German pilot might not have been an accident at all. Once the tank was confirmed to contain human remains, everything changed. What had started as a quiet geological survey was immediately sealed off. Access permits were revoked. Phones were collected. Satellite imagery of the area went dark for several days under the justification of environmental instability. Officially, the site was now classified as a historical recovery zone. Unofficially, people were being told not to talk. The skeleton inside the tank was removed first, not entirely, but carefully enough to document its position before disturbing anything else. The bones were brittle but intact, held together by remnants of uniform fabric that had fused with ice. There was no visible trauma to the skull. No fractures to the spine. No evidence of shrapnel or explosive force. That alone confused investigators. If the tank had been destroyed in combat, the remains would tell that story. But this death was different. Quiet. Contained. Forensic specialists estimated the individual's age at approximately 22 years old, consistent with wartime personnel assigned to that region in late 1944. Dental records were compared against incomplete military archives. Several possible matches emerged, but none could be confirmed outright. Too many files had been lost. Too many names never properly recorded. Still, one detail stood out. The individual inside the tank was not wearing standard armored crew boots. He was wearing flight boots. That single detail reopened a case no one expected to revisit. Military historians pulled transport logs, reassignment orders, and fragmentary personnel lists from the final year of the war. One name kept surfacing, not prominently, but repeatedly, attached to unusual footnotes. Temporary transfers. Unlogged assignments. A young pilot reassigned off flight duty and attached briefly to ground operations in mountainous terrain. His official status had remained unchanged for decades. Missing. Without trace. But the tank suggested otherwise. As more ice was removed, investigators documented the vehicle itself. There were no external markings indicating unit designation. The serial number plate had been deliberately scraped clean. Inside the radio compartment, wiring had been cut. Not damaged, but severed cleanly, as if disabled by hand. Even stranger were the fuel readings. The tank still contained reserve fuel. Enough, theoretically, to drive several more kilometers. Which raised a disturbing question. Why stop here? Ballistics experts examined the armor next. There were no shell impacts. No penetration marks. But on the left side panel, beneath layers of ice, they discovered a pattern of shallow dents, consistent not with artillery, but with repeated blunt force strikes from the inside. As if someone had been pounding against the hull. That discovery shifted the tone of the investigation. This was no longer about a vehicle lost to weather or war. This was about confinement. Meanwhile, archival researchers uncovered more anomalies tied to the same time period. In the weeks surrounding the convoy's disappearance, several intelligence reports referenced unverified hostiles operating in alpine corridors, groups that did not match Allied profiles. No uniforms. No insignia. No identifiable language intercepted over radio. The reports were vague, often dismissed, and later buried under more pressing wartime losses. But one memo, declassified decades later, contained a chilling line. Units entering sector fail to re-emerge. Cause unknown. Engagement not confirmed. At least 4 armored vehicles had gone missing within a 50-kilometer radius during that month alone. Only one had now been found. As the excavation continued, something else emerged beneath the tank. Tracks. Frozen into the ice below were deep impressions, boot prints leading away from the vehicle. They were spaced unevenly, suggesting injury. The direction pointed downhill, toward a ravine hidden by decades of snowfall. Search teams followed the line cautiously. 400 meters downslope, beneath a thinner layer of ice, they found scattered personal effects. A torn map. A cracked compass. A fragment of leather glove. All consistent with a single individual attempting to move on foot in sub-zero conditions. There were no remains. Which meant the skeleton in the tank was not the only person involved. The implication was staggering. If the pilot had exited the vehicle and attempted escape, who, or what, had sealed the tank afterward? Investigators considered every possibility. Could another crew member have survived and trapped him inside? Unlikely, given the absence of additional remains. Could local resistance forces have intervened? There was no historical evidence of partisan activity in that specific corridor at the time. Then there was the radio log. Buried deep in a box of misfiled transmissions was a brief audio fragment recovered from a damaged reel. It had been marked unintelligible and never transcribed. When audio engineers cleaned it up, only one voice could be heard, strained, urgent, and speaking German. The message was incomplete. Not aircraft, not Allied, moving between us. They know the route. Then interference. Then silence. No coordinates. No follow-up. The timestamp matched the day the convoy vanished. As news of the discovery leaked, despite attempts to contain it, families of missing soldiers began coming forward. Some had spent lifetimes searching for answers. Others had never known where their relatives were last stationed. A few had been told their loved ones were presumed captured. Others received nothing at all. For them, the tank was proof. Proof that someone, somewhere, had known more than they admitted. Yet the official response remained cautious. Authorities emphasized environmental explanations. Avalanches, disorientation, mechanical failure compounded by extreme weather. But privately, members of the recovery team admitted something didn't add up. Vehicles don't drive themselves into ice. Men don't lock themselves inside tanks. And records don't erase multiple disappearances without reason. As winter approached again, excavation efforts were suspended. The site was covered, marked for future study. But before the team left, ground scans revealed something beneath the ravine where the footprints ended. Another metallic mass. Smaller than the tank. Buried deeper. And aligned not randomly, but deliberately. As if placed there. If uncovered, it could explain whether the pilot truly escaped the vehicle, or if his fate was decided elsewhere. But funding approvals stalled. Jurisdiction disputes arose. And once again, the mountains kept their secret. For now. Because what lay beneath that second signal had the potential to rewrite not just one disappearance, but an entire chapter of wartime history. And some believed that whatever caused those vanishings was never meant to be found at all. Approval to excavate the second anomaly did not come easily. Months passed. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains once again, sealing the ravine beneath fresh layers of snow and ice. Officials cited safety concerns, jurisdictional overlap, and funding shortfalls. Behind closed doors, however, there was another reason, one never written down. Some discoveries don't answer questions. They multiply them. When work finally resumed the following year, the recovery team returned with fewer people and stricter oversight. Every movement was logged. Every photograph catalogued. Armed security was present, an unusual sight for what was officially classified as a historical recovery. The second object lay deeper than expected. It took days of controlled melting before its outline became visible. Unlike the tank, this object was narrow and elongated, its metal frame warped inward as if compressed by immense pressure. When enough ice was cleared, its shape became unmistakable. An armored personnel carrier. Smaller than the tank. Lighter. Faster. And empty. No remains inside. No equipment. No radio unit. Just claw-like scrape marks along the interior walls. Forensic teams documented everything in silence. The marks were not consistent with panic damage from impact. They ran vertically, irregular and deep, as though something, or someone, had struck the metal repeatedly over time. The vehicle's rear hatch was sealed from the outside. Whatever happened here had not been sudden. It had been deliberate. When investigators compared the carrier's serial fragments with fragmented wartime records, the result was unsettling. This vehicle had been part of one of the other units reported missing in the same month as the young pilot's disappearance. A second erased convoy. Now physically confirmed. The implication was clear. This was not an isolated incident. As attention returned to the pilot's tank, new forensic analysis focused on the skeleton itself. Microfractures in the ribs and forearms suggested prolonged strain rather than blunt trauma. Fingertip bones showed stress patterns consistent with repeated pressure, gripping, pulling, bracing. He had been alive inside that tank for hours. Possibly longer. The interior temperature would have dropped rapidly once the engine stopped. Hypothermia would have set in, but not immediately. He would have been conscious long enough to understand he was trapped. And alone. Yet the footprints downhill proved he had exited at least once. Which meant he had returned. Why would someone escape, only to go back inside? Investigators considered one possibility that no official report dared state plainly. He may not have been fleeing the tank. He may have been fleeing something else. Radio analysts revisited the final transmission again and again. Linguists noted subtle hesitations in the speaker's voice, confusion, not fear. The phrase, "they are not on the map," became a point of fixation. Not enemies. Not terrain. Not coordinates. Something unexpected. Military historians pointed out that during the final year of the war, numerous experimental operations were conducted in remote regions, some defensive, some covert, others never fully documented. There were rumors of units tasked with protecting sensitive corridors from threats that were never publicly acknowledged. But rumors are not evidence. And evidence, in this case, refused to speak clearly. What was undeniable was the pattern. Multiple units sent into the same alpine region. Multiple disappearances within weeks. Vehicles sealed, disabled, abandoned, not destroyed. Records altered. Reports downgraded. Silence maintained. When news of the findings finally reached the public, it did so in fragments. A tank recovered from a glacier. Human remains identified as a missing World War II soldier. A ceremonial reclassification of status, from missing to killed in action, recovered. There was a military ceremony held quietly in a nearby city. No speeches about mystery. No mention of the second vehicle. No explanation for why his remains were found inside a tank rather than on a battlefield. For the surviving family members, those few who could still be traced, it brought a measure of closure. A grave. A name restored. A story that finally ended. But for the investigators, the story did not end at all. Because some questions remained unanswered. Who sealed the tank after the pilot re-entered it? Why were radios deliberately disabled? Why did no Allied or Axis records acknowledge engagement in that area? And why did environmental data suggest prolonged activity beneath the ice long after the vehicles were buried? One final detail troubled the forensic team the most. Inside the tank, etched faintly into the inner hull near the hatch, were markings not caused by tools or damage. They were shallow, uneven, and traced repeatedly, as though someone had been counting time. Short lines, grouped in clusters. More than could be accounted for by a single night. The pilot had not died quickly. And he had not been the first. Today, the region remains restricted. Officially, it is due to unstable glacial conditions. Unofficially, no further excavation permits have been granted. The second vehicle was reburied after documentation. Data remains classified. The mountains are quiet again. But as glaciers continue to retreat, experts believe more metal will surface. More shapes. More stories the ice could no longer keep hidden. And when that happens, the disappearance of a 22-year-old German pilot may no longer be viewed as a tragic wartime anomaly, but as the first confirmed trace of something far larger. Something that passed through those mountains once. And left no witnesses behind. Except the dead. If a trained pilot escaped that tank, why did he go back inside? Who sealed it from the outside? And what was really moving through those mountains that night? Something never written into history. I want to know what you think happened. Drop your theory in the comments. Every detail matters. And if stories like this keep you watching, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. More forgotten stories are coming, and some secrets are still buried.